to this week's podcast. It's the Battle of the Draculas this week. We have got Dracula 1931 and Dracula 1958. Now, I've seen both of these films multiple times before, but am I right in thinking that it's the first time that you've seen at least one of these films, Rob?
Yeah. To make things less confusing, let's refer to Dracula 1931 as Dracula and Dracula 1958 as Horror of Dracula. I think that might just be a bit easier.
Yeah, the story of Dracula is that a young man called Renfield comes to stay at Dracula's castle, and he, is offering to buy, help Dracula buy property. But he eventually falls prey to Dracula and becomes one of his victims before Dracula moves on to London, where he kind of dines with high society and becomes a very, very charming social figure until he encounters Dr. Abraham Van Helsing, who immediately recognizes him for what he is. The Horror of Dracula. So the plotline follows Jonathan Harker coming to Castle Dracula on a secret mission to kill Dracula because he knows in this one that he's a vampire, and he encounters his bride and develops a kind of forbidden sexual attraction to the bride. So he goes and he tries to kill her out of this almost. It is presented as an honourable killing to try and save her soul, but in doing so awakens Dracula and is turned into a vampire himself. At this point, we then meet Van Helsing, played by Peter Cushing, and he is aware of vampires. I think that summarizes it correctly.
So for me, since I'm kind of the newcomer, I'll start with saying what I thought of both of them. I wasn't actually that much of a fan of Dracula, and the reason why is because although I did respect it on like kind of a technical level, on the influence on like the portrayal of vampirism in film and like even the horror genre as a whole, I personally couldn't really get that invested in the story. I didn't think that there was a character that I could really like experience the film through. It started out well, and that's because it did focus on this Renfield character and showed him meeting Dracula for the first time and showed him like seeing all this weird shit. But after that point, when it did that time skip, it became harder and harder to really get invested in the story. I wasn't really able to like even when it went to the characters that you could call the protagonists, I couldn't really connect with any of them necessarily. Also, I just felt that the film kind of suffered. Although it had atmosphere, it didn't really feel very, very gripping. I was never on the edge of my seat. I was never that like invested, which is all stuff that Horror of Dracula actually did manage to remedy for me. I would actually say that Horror of Dracula I preferred over Dracula. And the reason why I preferred it is because not only did it answer a few of my complaints, it just felt a lot more easier to kind of get sucked into. It felt easier to get sucked into the story and the world. And it also, to me, was scarier as well. It wasn't quite as atmospheric because it didn't have that black and white, but it was scarier. It was more intense. It was more gripping. And for me, it also just kind of has the appeal of like seeing actors like Christopher Lee, and Peter Cushing as well, like people who have this just immediate iconic kind of British status of just classy awesomeness. So that kind of just helped me kind of get sucked into the world a lot more. And there are other reasons why I liked it, but that's it basically. So yeah.
I agree that for me the favourite is the Horror of Dracula. I still think it's the best Dracula film ever produced, and Christopher Lee and Peter Cushing, that is a combination you cannot beat. If you've gone down or seen The Mummy and obviously The Curse of Frankenstein and all that kind of stuff, that's for me. But Hammer Horror is a very, very big soft spot for me because I love. To me, it was the classical period of British horror, and that's something that I have a real passion for. But to jump back to Dracula, because I do have a great love for Dracula, I agree with you that the opening is the strongest part of the film. I think it's where the kind of where the kind of stuff that you expect to come out comes, and it's where you get a sense of separation from Bela Lugosi's Dracula. So his performance gets to be this very, very hypnotic, magnetic thing, and a one-to-one relationship. And to me, that works really, really well. There's that opening scene where Dracula just appears out of nowhere and comes down those stairs and just speaks in the accent that I'm not even going to attempt to do. Everyone knows what Dracula sounds
Yeah,
like.
the classic Transylvanian
Yeah.
like at one.
Well, it's I mean, technically it's Hungarian, but it's what
Yeah.
we all call Transylvanian now. But the way that he delivers those lines, you get all at once. You get the allure of Dracula, something off about Dracula, fear of Dracula, all in that scene. And I think that moment where he sees the blood and kind of reacts, as well as it is classical and melodramatic. I mean, the film was made in 1931, but for me, that moment still really gets to me. When he sees the blood on the fingertip, and just really has to resist it like that, and the way the lighting just casts over his eyes, and that's all you can see.
It's maybe the only moment where Dracula ever comes off as, even though he's acting like a vampire, where he comes off as human.
Dracula 1931, it humanized Dracula in a way that made him more of a monster. I loved that because it kind of showed where the fear of the film comes from. It's seeing what Dracula has become and seeing hints of the man underneath. That's why I think Dracula works. I do agree with you that it kind of falters, but I think, in a way, it's got a villain protagonist. I think Dracula is sort of meant to be the protagonist, and because he's the one with the clearest goal. He wants to just infect everybody. Yeah, it's not a strong goal. It's the clearest goal that you can follow. And I think every character is designed as a response to Dracula. Renfield is at first impressed with his aristocratic wealth, and then slowly becomes more terrified as Dracula reveals his true vampiric nature, and obviously he loses. And then everyone else, it's just he becomes almost this existential threat, which I think is interestingly explored. But I think the problem is, whereas Mina and Jonathan are effectively meaningless in 1931's Dracula, like they are literal plot devices without much of an interesting thing to go with it, and I think that's a real shame because in the book they are, the two of the driving force characters. Never gets done well in adaptations, and that's something that is also criticism of the horror of Dracula. But having those recognizable characters for a lot of it was kind of a mistake. And though they did set up a strong protagonist with Van Helsing and Dracula, I never felt Van Helsing was in danger because he seemed to just know too much. It wasn't like in the Horror of Dracula. I think this is again part of the reason why the film's more thrilling and works, where Dracula is leaning over him, pushing down with the strength of 10 men, and it not only feels like he's pushing down with the strength of 10 men, he also kind of there for a moment like, Van Helsing looks like he's in a tight spot there. I'm not quite sure how he's going to get out of it. Yeah, and that don't get that feeling with 1931's Dracula. And while it is very atmospheric, I think that's something that it lacks. And I think the Horror of Dracula has a much more overly gothic atmosphere, which I think really works for the film. But it's also just got that sense of danger to it. Like Dracula is hypnotic, yes, but he almost feels like a wild animal. In 1958 Dracula, you get that fear and that power. It does help that Christopher Lee was 6'4", has probably one of the most commanding voices I ever put to the screen, and the expressions work and the grimaces really were fantastic.
That was something that kind of stuck out to me. So, for anybody who grew up in the 2000s or whatever, you were probably introduced to Christopher Lee through stuff like Lord of the Rings or even the Star Wars prequels and whatever. And from his work in those films and in other films that came out around that period that you did have an extremely commanding, heavy, very gravelly voice that just immediately commands respect. To me, it was very, very noteworthy going back to this film back when he was in his 40s or something.
It would have been is around his 30s.
So regardless of what age he was, in a lot of the film, he doesn't actually say anything, which I thought was a great choice. It makes him way more threatening. But also, he gets one scene where he does a lot of dialogue. And in that scene, I was kind of struck because I was struck by how just normal he sounded. He didn't sound at all like the Christopher Lee that as the Saruman or the Count Dooku or whatever. He just sounded like a regular guy. He didn't have any baritone to his voice whatsoever. He just sounded normal. And the way that the dialogue was written, it was quite it was kind of jarring, but it was quite good because he just seemed so casual. He was just able to be so casual not only in the lines but also in the delivery. Yet at the same time, the way he spoke, you can tell the Dracula doesn't have that much experience actually speaking with people because he sounded flat in a way that you would expect from somebody who maybe doesn't interact with people that much, or personally chooses not to interact with people that much. He sounded a bit flat, but he still did put on the air of seeming like a regular guy. And Harker came in, he was just like, "Hey, I'm Dracula. You can, sleep up in the bedroom if you want."
I think there was kind of a bit of a subtler threat to it as it went, but I think it's casual. But I agree with you. A lot of his non-verbal acting is really what you stay for, and there's this way he stands so impossibly still. I think that was perhaps one of the most compelling traits of his Dracula, because he could barely move, and then he'd slowly prowl. He just kind of stalked towards, and I think this is where they did the shot reaction perfectly, because you get obviously that moving forward, and then the shots start to, obviously on his female victims, and they are predominantly female, and I think that's an important distinction from the first film. When that camera starts to come over, the female victim, and obviously it gets more dominant under Dracula as he gets closer and as it gets there, and you get this really erotic charge to it that I feel is lacking. Like, you get, obviously the way that Hammer does his costumes, they're quite revealing. Let's be honest. You get that really close skin contact, and it almost seems like he's going to be kissing the neck rather than biting it for a lot of the film. He lays the victims down before he bites. There, I think that's where the kind of erotic charge Dracula really comes from, to be honest.
That erotic edge was kind of something that I felt, again, made this film better than the original. It did add a bit of like flavor, and it also kind of added a bit of subtext as well, because you could easily see Dracula as he's like a sexual predator. It's like he is very much a predator, but he basically, because the entire point is that he's trying to find a woman that he can turn into his bride, after his bride gets killed at the beginning. But that element is there even before the bride dies, because his original bride, tries to, like, she's getting Harker to think of her as a victim, but she's also clearly, there is that element of seduction. It's unspoken, but there is that element of seduction.
The reason that he goes to try and save her soul in the first place, because she does seduce him, and also the reason why I think that character could have been, can get, almost eaten, I suppose. Like why he's pulled in, and I think if Dracula hadn't been there to stop that, then she would have drained him dry. And I think actually that's a really great scene for Christopher Lee's performance, because and just establishing the threat of Dracula, because he storms into that room, and obviously the sound effects are fantastic. Just the big boom of the doors. And
it's the famous shot that people know of him, like opening his mouth with, like, blood coming out of his mouth. It's that famous bit.
And just watching that reaction, how quickly she's across that room, and just seeing him sweep in and just really dominate the space that he's in. It kind of jars you from that normal version of him that you saw before, and out that threatening, powerful monster that is obviously this much more physical threat than the original Will of Ghost of Dracula. And I think it really establishes the difference right off the bat, and I think that makes this Dracula feel dangerous and nasty.
The Lugosi one, I did find him a little bit hard to take seriously, but what I think that could be is just because the Lugosi version has kind of just been parodied so much that it can be a bit hard to, like, separate yourself from the sort of comedy that has been mined from that like his portrayal of that character. But that's something that I didn't feel with Lee. Like, I could completely take Lee seriously as Dracula, whereas Lugosi, I couldn't. I could take him seriously in a few scenes, but largely there was something about his acting where I wasn't quite able to, like, really think to myself, oh my god, this guy is scary. I was more like, I wasn't laughing or anything, but I found it a bit hard to, like, take his performance seriously.
Well, I think the difference between the films, the acting style in both films, it's quite naturalistic in Hammer Horror, despite being, all prim and proper and very, very English for a lot of it, like classically English, what people would expect it to be. It feels naturalistic and real, while obviously 1931 acting styles, it was still melodrama. That's still the gold standard back then. And I think now, to our sensibilities, where we're so consumed with ideas of method acting and getting the most believable performance as opposed to the most thematically evocative performance, I think that is where it can seem almost comical today. But I I've got a great reverence for those films. I'm talking about the entire Universal horror slate now. My favourite being 1933's Invisible Man, and actually I do want to talk about that at some point. But
Okay, yeah, I have that on DVD as well, so yeah, we could.
brilliant. But I do prefer Christopher Lee's performance, but I have
Mhm.
a massive soft spot for Bela Lugosi's performance. Define Dracula, I think, for a different nation. I mean, everyone knows how to do the accent and even though this isn't in the film, but the blah blah blah, I want to suck your blood,
The best bit of acting is also a famous bit in the film as well. The bit where he introduces himself itself. It's like his performance is all like, like I am Dracula.
creepy smile that he does. That it almost stretches out over his face, and it's like it's too much. I think that's what I get out of Bela Lugosi. The reason that he sticks out is he's so uncanny is because he's too much more than another person. And I think it works, but I think to modern sensibilities, I think it can be quite funny.
You might think to yourself like, oh my god, this guy could not blend. This guy just looks like an obvious villain, but that's just because like he kind of defined what a villain would look and sound and act like, to some degree.
Yeah, he did. I think he was never able to escape that in his career, which is a shame actually, because I think he wanted to quite a lot. But I think the work that he did to just define this character, I don't think it could have been done better. Honestly, I don't, because it was just he did get everything right. That tortured, lonely soul, you saw that, and sometimes you did get the idea that compulsive addiction to drinking blood was kind of just keeping people around. I mean, he wanted Mina as a companion. That's why he was drinking from her. I think that's kind of what the 1931 film gets really, really, really well done. Like it gets to that drive of what Dracula is, a lonely monster. That it defined Dracula as that. And I think in that purpose it worked really, really well. While Lee's Dracula was much more of I think what the original book meant him to be, which was this existential threat of rampant sexual power and almost satanic and abhorrent moral methods that were kind of trying to be suppressed in the Victorian society the book was written. And I think that's the difference fundamentally between the two Draculas.
I kind of also see the reversal of what you're talking about. Like, I can see how what you said about the Lugosi Dracula character applies to the Lee Dracula, and I can see how what you said about the Lee Dracula applies to the Lugosi character, and it's in a couple of specific ways. So, the Lugosi Dracula, I think that his character is also kind of I guess you could say, existential threat because of not only how he corrupts the mind of Renfield, but also because like he has more than one bride as well. But with the Lee Dracula, I can see him as like not necessarily a lonely monster, well, somewhat of a lonely monster because he has one bride, and once that bride gets killed, he tries to turn Lucy into that bride, and then she gets staked, and then finally tries to do the same thing on Mina, and then he gets killed, So it's never like played for like tragedy or anything, but I can see that he doesn't want that this is a Dracula, that Lee's Dracula does not want to be alone. He needs a woman, he needs a bride, another vampire to be with him, and he will do anything he can after he loses one to get another one.
Yeah, okay, I can see that. I can see that. To be fair, I just think it's more of a driving force for Lugosi's Dracula than it is for Lee's. I think not that they don't both have the same traits, but I think the way the film treats it, the Lugosi film is very much about it's about both the fear of the unknown and the fear of being alone. I think that is what the
Yeah.
film does. While Hammer Horror of Dracula was much is and it does it in a very specific way, but it's very much about dangers of foreign interference and the danger of sexual immorality and depraved antics to a sensible society. And I think especially if you take into account the cultural context films were developed in, I think those were America was at the height of its isolationism and it kind of almost showed a consequence of
In,
that.
in 1931.
Yeah, because it had a policy of isolationism at that time. It really didn't want to be involved with the rest of the world too much. And then you had it was part of the reason why Pearl Harbor was able to happen and why America didn't get involved in World War II sooner. Also, the horror of Dracula, it was during a time where British social revolutions had started to happen after World War II, and the class system and rules around sexuality in British society were being massively challenged. And they're both challenges in a way. I think the Horror of Dracula is very much a challenge to the kind of newfound example of the British, and it represents it in Dracula in the way that he corrupts young people by kind of giving them more sexual agency and things like that. While you watch 1931 Dracula, and it's very much kind of, Dracula is basically defeated by cooperation. That's how he gets beaten. Van Helsing, Mina, Jonathan, all together.
Also see Horror of Dracula as well. To some degree, it's about like upholding family to an extent. Like I see Horror of Dracula as like, Dracula coming along and disrupting this kind of family unit, like the family unit that's made up of Arthur, Mina, Lucy, even the little girl daughter. Dracula is kind of disrupting that through what he does to Lucy, and then to some degree tries even further to disrupt it with his like kidnapping of Mina as well, an attempt to turn her into another bride like that. Arthur, although he does join Van Helsing and he does ultimately come to believe him, he doesn't really take part in the final battle that much. Like, all he really does is that he just, like, gets his wife out of the grave that Dracula was trying to bury, and that was it. For the most part, it's really just Van Helsing who does all the work. You could say it's about how families are kind of how the standard British families are kind of helpless to any of these problems, and that you need like a specialist. You need somebody who has an understanding of these problems to come and like sort them out.
Yeah, it was a theme in both films really, and both of them again it was Van Helsing, and
Mm-hmm.
I think the treatment of them was different because Van Helsing in the original in Dracula I would say was kind of like a support to the team, while Van Helsing in Horror of Dracula was much more of an action man. He was like, no, I'm going to deal with this on my own. I can sort this out.
Horror of Dracula, to me, it almost felt like a kind of setup for for like the kind of slasher films that you would see like in the 70s and 80s. It felt kind of similar, a lot like it felt very similar to them, only it didn't have a high body count. But it felt kind of similar in the sense that you had this threatening figure who didn't appear that much but was capable of like killing people. Like it felt kind of similar to like Halloween in many ways. But like Dracula was kind of the Michael Myers, and Van Helsing was kind of like the Loomis. He was kind of like the Dr. Loomis figure. He was the one who knew everything that there was to know about the threat that they were facing. Like he was always trying to like save people. He's always like he essentially is kind of like the Batman to Dracula's Joker, in the sense that both of them are just like intertwined. They're both each other's nemesis. Whatever happens, like their fight ends up, coming into all of these other unrelated people. It's like I might have gotten off track, but basically what I'm trying to say is that like I felt that a bit. I felt that Horror of Dracula, out of the two films, was much more influential on more like modern media, like specifically like horror media.
I would agree with that. I think it, kind of established the first sense of real danger. It was, I think, difference was it didn't just rely on atmosphere.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was a change for it that made it kind of work really, really well. And I think it sets the template as well, because the monster was at once somewhat understandable, but then does something that rocks that understanding completely, and then is this just not ununderstandable monster throughout the rest of the film. I think that's brilliant. I think also Terence Fisher is at times a more confident director than Todd Browning. I think Browning plays it quite safe with the kind of attitudes of the time, while Terence Fisher in his direction was willing to kind of push the bar as pretty much was as far as you could really get in 1958 with the Hollywood production code still in place, because you really just the amount of blood in the Horror of Dracula was just, oh my god. For a film of the time, it was. To be fair, even now, I'd sit there and be like, yeah, that's enough blood for a vampire film. Also, the way it is, I think that's something that I love about Dracula. I think color helps it as well. It makes it just so vivid, and I'm not one of those that will argue against black and white, because I love black and white. But I think I think for Dracula, just seeing the vivacity of the red blood and the way it pooled and congealed, and that was just, that for me was just one of I suppose it's a little bit of abhorrent viewing pleasure, really. But
Like anytime there is violence, it's quite uncomfortable to watch as well.
yeah,
It's very much like, and that was something again that Horror of Dracula has over the original Dracula, because in the original Dracula, like anytime you saw someone get bit, the camera just kind of faded out. Like you never got a moment of on-screen violence. And to me, there wasn't really a moment that I found to be particularly scary.
moments that I find very memorable in the first film.
Mm.
But I think the first film I kind of view now. I mean, it is a horror film, but I do still view it less as a horror film, more of a character study of Dracula. And I think in that way it works. There are shots that I will never forget from the original Dracula. Like I think are probably the most iconic Dracula shots of all time, like him on the stairs and the what music they make line. Oh, final shot of Dracula's tomb, that massive, imposing shot through that tomb. I think that was just phenomenal. But I think it has. I think as a horror film, it's lost its bite over the years.
It's more like just kind of atmospheric than outright scary. I wouldn't say that it ever had a lot of bite to begin with. I think it was more just it came across as a bit scarier to like an audience in 1931 compared to an audience in 1960 or even like 2020.
True, but it would have still had a bite for them. I think it's a great film. Dragon Knight was a fantastic film. I'm just I think for a modern sensibility, it doesn't work as a horror anymore.
I wouldn't call it much of a character study either. But then again, that's just my view on it. I can see how you view it as one. So the thing that does add the most horror-ish element to it is the Renfield character and how he gets turned insane. And I do have to admit that like easily the best and most scariest aspect is by far the guy who plays Renfield. His name's like Dwight Fry or something.
Yeah,
it was actually amazing. Like I thought he was legitimately chilling in the role of Renfield because he did sell, like just being a normal guy, and then when he made it was a bit too sudden for me. The transition between him being normal and him being insane. But when he was insane, I felt that the film got a lot scarier, just because it was like he so convincingly sold the idea of a man who had just completely lost his mind.
Yeah, I think that suggested the idea of Dracula really well throughout the film. I think that's what keeps the threat level up, even when it's not shown on screen. I think that it's that memory of Renfield and what happened to him. Sure, I'm going to take back an earlier comment. I think it still works as a horror. It's just not a horror in the same way that we consider a horror now, while the Horror of Dracula is. I think what I love about both films, though, and it's why I go over them to a modern horror, because I can find some modern horror quite difficult to get through. Not because it's scary, but because it's boring. The atmosphere keeps me engaged with both films, no matter what's happening. I never get bored watching them. I might not get so as scared watching one of them, but I don't ever get bored. And they don't rely on jump scares as much. Their atmosphere creates dread, which creates constant dread. There is constant dread, and to me, that's what really, really works about these two as horror films. It's what I want to. It's what I really want to see out of more horror is the constant feeling of dread. Because even with films that have quite a few more jump scares, like Halloween and like the early wave of slasher films, they still create an atmosphere of dread and tension building up and up and up throughout, and then that's why the jump scares work. Well, I feel like a lot of horror films now kind of establish what the monster is and kind of a legend thing and kind of almost spell it out without creating the atmosphere needed to make me feel that monster. And I'm not saying it's all, because there are some brilliant ones out there. The Babadook, for example, stuff like The Conjuring, for example, is kind of for me, it is a film that tries to scare you with an atmosphere it doesn't set up, jumps things out at you to kind of raise your heart rate, but it doesn't particularly terrifying, and I don't remember after T-3 minutes once I'm done with the film.
I think that way about some of the spin-offs. I wouldn't say about the first and second one. I mean, I remember liking both of them, but I get what you mean, I think that what also kind of helps as well is that both of them are fairly short. On the one hand, the short length is kind of a benefit because it means that the films don't really waste their time or anything. They just kind of get to the point. And that's something that, personally speaking, if there's something that any film that claims to be in the horror genre, if there's anything that it needs to do, it kind of needs to be tight. Like I feel like horrors and thrillers are the kind of films that need that kind of tightness because they need to be able to grip you.
They can't lag or it's broken.
Yeah, like well, especially with horror films. Like if you like last year, there were like three horror movies that were like 2.5 hours, and I felt that like with all of the films, I felt that that was a problem with each of them, that they were just too long. And I think that again, it's like if you're
Well,
gonna make a film that tries to be scary, then for me the rule is like 2 hours or less. I don't think it should go over 2 hours
I
for
think I
me.
think I think the thing with horror is you can only be scared for so long. It's not, you can't really be entertained for too long. You could get entertained for like 6 hours long. So stuff like action films, well, they should be tight because it does
Yeah.
lead to a more entertaining thing. You can get away with having them be a bit longer, or
Hmm.
something that's a bit more,
Like an action epic, because there are action
or actual,
epics.
yeah, or just actual epics like The Godfather and things like that that really make you consider the morality of the situations
Hmm.
strongly and make it really complicated. They kind of almost should be longer, I would
Yeah.
argue. But something like a horror film, I think between 90 to 110 minutes is exactly where you want to be, and you don't want to overstay that welcome.
It's kind of a benefit, but I do think it's a bit of a flaw as well, at least when it comes to the endings of both films. Now, like I think the Horror of Dracula has a much better final like conclusion than Dracula 1931 because although I mean the bit on the stairs with Renfield is pretty good, but other than that it's kind of just over with very very quickly. But Horror of Dracula has much more of a traditional like kind of action climax. But in the case of both films, I think that they do end a bit abruptly, particularly Horror of Dracula, that I was liking a lot more. I would have liked to have had maybe just an epilogue or just a bit more of a denouement, maybe because that film and the other and Dracula 1931, both of them just sort of end very abruptly, and even the climax itself is like the last 5 minutes of the film.
Yeah,
it's not
yeah.
particularly stretched out. I don't know how other Dracula adaptations have done this, but I do feel like that would be like something that I would like to see be fixed. Just extend the ending a little bit. I mean, do you think that either of the films that their conclusions are a bit too short or their endings too abrupt?
Yeah, I can see what you mean. I think I think they were kind of done, but with the story, I think the story of them it was finished. But I think at the same time, they did seem an abrupt ending, and maybe there should have been something to help ease it a bit. I think maybe an epilogue was just a little bit of a resolution afterwards could have been nice, but then I also am of the mind that if it didn't end so abruptly, maybe it wouldn't have worked so well. Yeah, because obviously the story was done, and I would rather a bit of an abrupt ending than something staying too long. Like
Yeah,
some films just do end quite abruptly, and I think sometimes that works. I think it works. I think it works with both of these films as well. To be honest.
I mean, it could have been something that was a bit more clear to me, just because I wasn't watching the film at the cinema. I was watching it on like a laptop, and when you look at the runtime, you look at it and you see like, oh shit, there's only like 5 minutes left, or you see like, oh crap, there's only like a minute left, and they haven't killed Dracula yet. And also, I think it was also the fact that the films themselves, both of them, like especially 1931, they showed the entire credits, all of them at the beginning, and then it was just the end. Whereas Horror of Dracula did have opening credits and end credits. So that feeling of abruptness was kind of there was a bit more of an easing you into it because
Well, I
that
think
it did at least have the final shot and then end credits.
yeah. Well, I think quite often with films today, you don't see opening credits as much anymore. I mean, you sometimes do, but you sometimes don't. And I think the fact that they're not so apparent when you realise how overdone they used to be is how it was on them before. I think it sometimes take a bit by surprise. I think that's just something watching an old film, you've got to remember that. I think sometimes they do tend to end more abruptly. I find because we're used to the end credits and they're just not there.
I mean, I do love opening credit sequences whenever they do pop up in films nowadays, but there is something that I do kind of like about, a film that just kind of just gets the ball rolling, instantly. I mean, especially I especially don't like it whenever a film opens with like a minute and a half of like production logos as well. Like for me as a viewer, I just kind of want the film to begin. I don't want it
To be
to waste
honest,
my time.
I quite often do not care about logos. If they weren't at the start of films, I wouldn't care. If they're all at the end, I'd quite happily look at them. But all of them being at the start, I don't. For me, it doesn't settle me in. I think it's sometimes used to get around having to shoot a really long tracking shot that won't distract you during the opening credits. I think.
What do you mean?
But I find that logos are kind of used throughout, and they kind of settle you into the mood before you start the film because they play the right, especially when they play the right music over them. The logos are silent. Although when logos have their own sound, that's when it gets annoying for me. Like for
Okay.
example, the Dark Knight trilogy, because I
Yeah.
always bring things back to the Dark Knight trilogy somehow.
Mhm.
They
It's about that, so yeah.
Yeah. Well, the logos in those films, you've got the Dark Knight music playing over it. That really does settle you in, and then when you start, you
Mhm.
can just stop, which he does, which Nolan does immediately.
In terms of like major films that don't have like a big opening credit sequence, that's definitely one of them. It doesn't even have a title card. It just has the Bat logo, however it's shown, and then just you go into the film. Like I'm fine. I'm still fine with like opening credit sequences themselves, just because to me, again, they can set the mood. And I mean, I did. If there was one thing that I preferred about the 31 Dracula to the 58 Dracula, it probably was the opening title sequence. At least just because it uses the Swan Lake music, and to me, I love the Swan Lake theme because it really just it both feels very atmospheric and it also just kind of grips you as well. It's a
Yeah.
very gripping piece of music, and it's quite good as music to have over the opening titles. And the opening credit sequence to Horror of Dracula was good. Don't get me wrong, but it was definitely. But I think 31 just left more of an impression on me just because of that music. But yeah, I mean, but I would have liked it if they could have both had that and also you know uh, an extended ending. One other improvement about Horror of Dracula as well was that like set up, and I saw that it wasn't made for that much money. It was made very cheaply, but I didn't really feel that during the film. I feel like the film really got around its low budget very, very well.
Sure. I think
But
the reason for that as well is production design, and
yeah,
that's something that I want to touch on quickly. Actually, I think the production design, there's a difference in the production design between the two films. Like
mhm,
the original Dracula looked grand and impressive, but it felt like almost any rich person's place. And the castle, the castle, like the opening part of the castle was brilliantly atmospheric, cobwebs
mhm,
everywhere, and the huge windows. But then his actual room inside, it didn't feel distinctive when if they were in Dracula's study. Well, in Horror of Dracula, and you know, just it's such bold, imposing colours, and you got a few more of those angular hallways, and each room feels grand and impressive, but you get that just that blood red everywhere.
yeah,
And different rooms feel distinctive from each other very, 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 very quickly. And you've got all those. It's not a clean place, and you've got all the hints of it being old, while it still looks like something that could fool you. I think it's such a colourful and bold production design in the Hammer films. You can't help but pay attention when it's combined with the cinematography, which I think is really, really grand for 1958 Dracula, because I love the way the camera is so still, and then it just bursts to life when the same way that Dracula will, and
mhm,
it kind of follows his mood. And I think that really, really works. You get that prowling sense, you get those explosive moments. It really supports it. I think it does a good job of showing when it is still. It shows off that production design. I think subjects are quite often not that large in frame, and you get those
mhm.
imposing staircases, those impossibly tall roofs, that jarring stonework. And I think that really, really sells part of the atmosphere of that film. I think it's why it feels like it was more expensive than it was.
Like in the first Dracula film, whenever like it showed bats, I was thinking to myself like, those are just prop bats. I was never thinking to myself, oh, those are real bats. I kind of just knew that they were props. There was never a moment like that in Horror of Dracula. There was never a moment where I thought to myself, oh, that's just a prop, or that's just an effect. Because there was something about it that felt impressively that felt that felt grounded. There was
Well,
something grounded about the film.
I think the thing that was very smart about it is it didn't try and do something it couldn't. It just went, okay, we don't have much money. So
Mhm.
let's focus on those human conflicts and really get that tone right. Well, fantastic. And I think that was a move that paid off. And I think Hammer forgot it later on in their later films, and when they started pushing for more, they pushed the sexuality and the violence to the max, and kind of forgot a bit about the atmosphere and the tone. And I think that's part of the reason the films declined in the end. I think the Horror of Dracula is almost the pinnacle of Hammer horror for me. It is the quintessential Hammer horror film, the one I come back to again and again and again.
What was it? Was it the beginning
Not
of their
quite,
films?
not quite. There was the Curse of Frankenstein beforehand, but it was one of the first, and it was their longest running series because it was
Mhm.
just so good. And Christopher Lee's Dracula was so magnetic, and Peter Cushing's Van Helsing was just a phenomenal star. I think it's always quite interesting seeing Peter Cushing play a hero when most people know him from Star Wars more likely.
Casting in Star Wars was a bit against type because normally he would play the hero, but obviously Morph Tarkin was just such an iconic villain that people then forever associated him with that role
Yeah,
more so than when he was Van Helsing. At the same time, though, like it is very clear watching him like why he was always cast as the hero because he just naturally has that kind of like he's almost got that kind of Patrick Stewart quality to him about like how he just comes off as a leader. Like he comes
yeah,
off as the kind of person who you would easily just trust no matter what he was saying. He could be playing I don't know like a flat earther or a conspiracy theorist or whatever, and you would probably believe him, because he has that kind of like I know what's going on at all times. I know everything, and you need to do what I say quality without coming across as like demeaning or bossy or anything like that or like crazy. That was something that worked. I mean, even though he's not necessarily the best protagonist, but he is a good character to follow. And he works well when compared with like Michael Gough as Arthur, who is the kind of the quintessential like skeptic character who's all like at first like, oh my god, you're talking crazy talk, you like even like blaming him for like the bad stuff that's been happening, but then after a certain point he just realizes, oh no shit, Van Helsing, you're right, I should help you, like. So with the first Dracula I was thinking like I get that this is an important part of the film history, but I couldn't get into it. But thankfully, with Horror of Dracula, I was able to both get invested and also see its place in film history as well. So, like, I don't love either film, but I would definitely say that Horror of Dracula is one of those rare instances where it's kind of a remake, but it's better than the original for me. So that's my opinion overall. What's your concluding
I'm
opinion?
I'm a great lover of both of these films. I think the Horror of Dracula is one of the best horror films ever produced, and I will take that to my grave. For me, I think they're both brilliant examples of what atmosphere can do for a film, and I think in that way, it's almost a lost art of atmosphere in a horror film that I really
Mhm.
wish to get back more often because I have more of a reaction watching these than I do films that are designed to evoke a physical reaction because I care more about the atmosphere. And I think that's why I love these films so much.
So we both recommend these films. I think that they're interesting for historical purposes, but I think that I'm sure that certain viewers can probably get stuff out of both of them, and you recommend them as well.
I
On
do
similar
recommend
basis.
these films. I just think they're wonderful and
Mhm.
just a gothic atmosphere you don't really get anymore. And
I think you said that they're like your top two vampire films as well.
yeah, they are. They are. They're my favorite. They're my favorite vampire film. No, actually, no, they're not. Sorry. 1958 Dracula's The Horror of Dracula. That's in my top two. The other one's Interview with the Vampire, and
Yeah.
then
Okay.
then,
Mhm.
then Dracula. No.
Okay. All right. Yeah. I'm sure that ranking will forever change, but that's how it is now, I assume.
Oh yeah, yeah. I mean, absolutely. Things will shift it if there's a better vampire film that comes along. Actually, I've let the right one in my top two actually above, but with The Horror of Dracula. Actually, now I'm thinking about it. But
Yeah.
but anyway, do you know what? Let's not talk about my ranking of vampire films. I
Yeah.
will inevitably keep remembering vampire films. Dracula is my favourite vampire film, and I watch
Mhm.
it every year. I cannot recommend that one highly enough. And 1931's Dracula is very, very interesting from a historical perspective, and I think it's still worth a watch today. As I think it's effective. Might not be scary so much anymore, but I think it's
Mhm.
an effective atmosphere that kind of keeps you in a state of perpetual dread or at least slight unease, and I think that's enough.
For our next episode, we will be discussing two films, and unlike this video, it will be split up into two parts. We will be discussing two movies that I like to label very like recent and kind of true examples of what the fuck Hollywood, like films that have great talent attached to them, have kind of interesting central concepts, but execute them in the most insane, bizarre, misguided, yet fascinating ways possible. These two films are Serenity and Collateral Beauty. Collateral Beauty will come first and Serenity will come next. And oh boy, do I have a lot to say about both of them. Jack hasn't watched them yet, so we'll see what he thinks. But yeah.
All right, thank you very much for listening, guys.
Yeah. See ya. Bye. A reference I just want to make as well. I felt watching this film that I think that Tim Burton probably loves this film because not only did he cast like Michael Gough and Christopher Lee several times in his own films, like like Batman or like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory or like Alice in Wonderland and stuff, and other movies that he got Lee to star in or Michael Gough to star in, but also just the kind of look as well. I was thinking to myself, like, because it has that same gothic style. I was thinking to myself,
Tim Burton grew up on horror. I do believe that this is one of the films that he watched a lot. I think he watched a lot of Vincent Price and things like this, and I think
and anything gothic, anything like that. Yeah, and anything gothic, anything like German expressionist, anything like that is like clear in his films. Or with this film particularly, I was thinking like, wow, he must have saw this film and like jumped with joy when he got to work with like Gough or Lee or in his own films, and he cast them more than once as well. So yeah, I mean it does, yeah. So from that level, it's quite